Hi, I'm Alexis Wadeland, osteopath at Blossoming Me and Healthy Learning Lounge, and welcome back to our Recovery Reframed series. Last week, we explored one of the biggest assumptions I hear in clinic. My body is out of alignment. We talked about how posture absolutely matters, but it's only one piece of a much bigger picture. Today, I'd like to gently challenge another assumption that I hear almost every day. If it hurts here, then here's where the problem is. Now, before we go any further, I want to make something really clear. If you're in pain, your pain is real, it is important, and it really deserves to be listened to. Today isn't about dismissing your pain, it's about understanding your pain a little bit more deeply. Because I think when we understand pain differently, we often begin recovery differently too. A little while ago, a lovely lady came to see me because of persistent pain in her shoulder. Before she'd even sat down, she pointed out to the outside of her shoulder and said, "It hurts right here. Can you fix that muscle for me?" And honestly, if I wasn't trained in this area, that's probably exactly what I'd be thinking too. If it's where it hurts, surely that's where the problem is. It's quite logical and sensible and very human. And it's exactly why so many of us naturally focus all of our attention on that painful area. So instead of jumping straight into examining her shoulder, we started to talk, and I asked her, when did this pain begin? What makes it worse, or what makes it better? Has the pain changed recently? How have you been sleeping? What sort of work have you been doing? Were there any previous injuries? How stressed have you been? At first glance, none of these questions seemed too much to do with her shoulder, but gradually a picture started to emerge. She'd recently been spending much longer at the computer. She'd been under quite a bit of stress, and she wasn't sleeping particularly well. She'd stopped the exercises that she had been doing because her shoulder was sore. With deeper thought, she also noticed that she wasn't breathing as well because movement had become uncomfortable. By the time we'd finished talking, we already knew much more than simply her shoulder hurts. Then we did the examination. Her shoulder was certainly irritated, but that wasn't all that we found. Her upper back was quite stiff and not moving well. Her rib cage wasn't expanding particularly well. She wasn't breathing deeply into her diaphragm. Her neck muscles were working much harder than they needed to. And with all of that, you could see that her breath was much more shallow and up in the chest. Her arm wasn't swinging as naturally when she was walking. Suddenly, her shoulder wasn't the only thing telling us parts of the story. One of the phrases I've started to use in clinic is primary driver. By that, I simply mean the influence that's currently having the biggest impact on the way your body is functioning. Sometimes the primary driver is exactly where the pain is. If you've sprained your ankle, the ankle is almost certainly that primary driver. If you've fractured your wrist deserves our immediate attention because it is the primary driver. Sometimes the painful area really needs to be what is focused on first. But many ongoing aches and pains are a little more complicated than that. Sometimes the painful area is one important piece of the puzzle, while another part of the body, or the way different systems are working together, is having a much bigger influence than we may first realize. That's why I try not to ask, where is the problem? Instead, I like to try and work out what is the primary driver creating this pain, because these two questions don't always lead to the same answer. I often think of pain as being like the loudest voice in the room. When someone speaks loudly, of course we pay attention. We should, but just because they're the loudest doesn't mean they're the only person speaking, or the only person with something important to say. Pain is much the same. Pain is often the loudest voice, but not always the only one. Sometimes there are quieter influences in the background. Your breathing, the way your rib cage moves, how you're sleeping, the way you're moving, how you're coping with your stress, and an old injury that may have changed the way you're walking or moving, the way load is transferring through your body every day. These quieter voices may not be shouting, but they may still be influencing the way that your body is functioning. And part of my job is to listen to all of them and piece together how they fit. That's why I often describe assessment as feeling a little bit like a detective. Not because I'm trying to find one thing that's wrong, but because I'm trying to understand the whole story and see what the body is telling me and the clues that bring the picture together. Pain is one important clue, and we should absolutely pay attention. But it's really the beginning of a conversation, not the end. And that's one of the reasons I love what I do. Every person who walks through the door brings a different story, different experiences, different challenges, different bodies, adapting in different ways. My job isn't simply to treat the loudest symptom. It's to understand what's driving the whole story, to identify the primary driver or the few drivers that are important to treat, and that's where things often start to change. So let's come back to the lovely lady with the shoulder pain. Her shoulder certainly deserved attention. It was sore, it wasn't moving comfortably, muscles were tight, and it was affecting her day-to-day life. But by the time we'd finished talking and assessing her body, we realised something really important. The shoulder wasn't the only thing asking for help. Her rib cage and thoracic spine were not moving particularly well. Her breathing had become more shallow, and she'd stopped exercising because every movement made her worried that she was making things worse. And she also wasn't sleeping well, and she was carrying more stress than she'd even realised. And so gradually her whole body begins to adapt and work around a shoulder that also has some things going on. Now, does that mean the shoulder was not important? Definitely not. It was incredibly important. It was just that it was one part of a bigger story. And it reminds me that the human body is wonderfully connected. It is constantly adapting, constantly compensating, constantly trying to keep us as functional as possible, despite everything that life is throwing at us. Sometimes those adaptations help us. Sometimes, over time, they begin to create new challenges. But almost always, it's happening for a reason. And understanding that reason is often where real progress can begin. One of the biggest changes in healthcare over the past few decades has been the way that we come to understand pain. Years ago, it was often viewed as, quite simply, something hurts. Something must be damaged. Fix that damage and then the pain will go away. And sometimes, in specific acute cases, that is exactly what's happening. If you cut your finger, the finger will hurt. And if you sprain your ankle, then the ankle will hurt. If you fracture a bone, that injury deserves immediate attention. Pain can be very accurate as a warning signal. But as research continued asking questions, they noticed something fascinating. Pain doesn't always behave as expected. People with very similar injuries often experience very different amounts and types of pain. Some people had significant changes on scans and yet felt remarkably comfortable. Others had very little showing on imaging, but they were experiencing considerable discomfort. The relationship between tissues and pain turned out to be far more complex than anyone had originally imagined. That did not make pain less real. It made it more interesting. One of the ways I like to think about pain is your body's protective alarm system. Imagine you're cooking dinner. Something catches fire. The smoke alarm goes off. The alarm isn't the fire. The alarm is trying to draw your attention to the fact that there is something important going on. Its job is to protect you. Pain works in a remarkably similar way. Its job isn't simply to measure damage. Its job is to protect you. Sometimes it does that incredibly accurately, and sometimes it becomes a little overprotective. Sometimes it stays switched on longer than it needs to be, or it seems to need to be. Sometimes it responds to a whole collection of influences rather than just one injured tissue. But through it all, it's trying to keep you safe. I actually find that incredibly reassuring because it changes the conversation from my body is working against me, why is it always wrong, to my body is trying to help me, and how can I help it, even if it isn't seeming to get everything right. That's a very different way of looking at ourselves. Now, I want to be careful here. I'm certainly not saying we ignore pain. Quite the opposite. Pain deserves our attention. It deserves respect and it requires investigation. But I think we shouldn't be automatically assuming that the pain is telling us the entire story. Instead, we use it as a clue and we become curious. What is my body trying to protect? Why now? What has changed? What patterns am I noticing? Has my movement changed? Has my breathing changed? Has something else that I'm doing regularly changed? Is my sleeping different? Am I under more stress lately? Am I moving less because I'm worried about it making things worse, or because it's difficult, or because life has gotten in the way? Those questions often tell us much more than simply asking, where does it hurt? One of the things I've noticed over the years is that people often become frightened by persistent pain. And, well, that would be completely understandable. Pain can be exhausting too, and it can be very, very frustrating. It could affect your sleep, your work, your confidence, your ability to enjoy life. But one of the most rewarding parts of my job is seeing what happens when people begin to understand their body just a little bit more and a little bit differently maybe. As they begin to become less fearful, they often are more willing to explore movement again. And as they can begin to explore movement more confidently, the body can start to rediscover its options. Movement can become less guarded, breathing can become easier, confidence grows a little bit. Not because we're ignoring the pain, and definitely not because we're pushing through pain, but because we're starting to listen to the whole body and the whole story, instead of just the loudest voice. So that brings me to something I'd love for you to remember from today's conversation. Pain points us towards the problem. It doesn't always explain the problem. Pain is one of the body's most important ways of communicating with us, and we should listen. It is very, very useful, and it can help us to not overdo things. But we should also remember that pain is often the loudest voice, not the only voice. And when we begin listening to the other quieter voices as well, we can start to understand our body in a completely different way. So once you begin looking at pain through this different lens, you start to see it everywhere. Not because a painful area has a hidden cause somewhere else, and certainly not because a painful area doesn't matter, because obviously it does, but because the body is wonderfully interconnected. And I've never met two people whose bodies tell exactly the same story. That's one of the reasons I get to enjoy what I do, because even though I'm treating people all day, every time it's different. Every person is showing something new and teaches me something new. Every assessment reminds me to stay curious, because although people may arrive with the same diagnosis or pain area, the story behind the pain is often completely different. And that's why I don't believe in trying to force every person into the same treatment approach, or everyone with one diagnosis gets the same treatment. Take headaches, for example. I've had people come into the clinic convinced that the answer must be their neck. And sometimes their neck is a main part of what's going on, and it absolutely deserves attention. But as we spend more time exploring the story, we might also notice that the jaw has been working incredibly hard. Their breathing has become more shallow, and their upper ribs don't move as they should. They're carrying enormous amounts of stress, and maybe even they're sleeping poorly. Often, they might be spending more time working, maybe at a computer for long hours, or perhaps they've stopped moving because of stress or fear about making their headache worse, or some other factor going on in their life. As we actually start to deal with all of these different influences, gradually things will improve. Very often the headaches will begin to change as well. Now, we probably need to treat the neck, but we don't only look at the neck. Even if the neck had been more stiff and painful, and probably was a major part of the story. Or perhaps someone comes in with persistent heel pain. Naturally, their attention is going to be on their heel. That would make perfect sense. It is where it hurts. But as we start looking more broadly, we might notice that they've changed the way that they're walking. That's pretty likely given that their heel is hurting. Their calf might be very tight, their ankle might not be moving very well. In fact, the foot joints might be compressed and stuck. Their hips also might not be sharing load effectively anymore. And they avoid certain movements because they don't trust that the foot will work properly or not hurt anymore. The heel deserves treatment, but sometimes helping the heel also means helping the whole rest of the system to work together again. So the same would be true for lower back pain. Many people arrive convinced that their back is weak or unstable or it's gone out again. And yes, the back may well need a lot of attention. But over the years I've come to notice that some people breathe almost entirely in their upper chest. Others have very stiff rib cage. Some have hips that don't move well anymore. And the tensions between different parts of the body and the way they actually work together causes the lower back to then have to work harder or to get stuck in certain ways, allowing the lower back to have to bear the brunt of the load and get painful. But the lower back wasn't the cause of the problem. So we need to treat the stiff hips or the poorly acting gluteal muscles or the rib cage stiffness or their breathing in order to allow the body to communicate correctly and transfer load effectively to take the load off the lower back. If we don't treat those things, then the lower back will have to stay in pain. Fear of hurting yourselves further also stops us moving, and that also affects how our lower back can begin to recover and return to normal mobility, function, and comfort. As confidence in movement gradually return, our movement often also starts to become easier. And then the areas of the body begin to work better, so our breathing improves and different parts of the bodies start to share load again. The back then will become happier too. not because we ignored it, but because we helped the whole system function more effectively together. One of the things I've noticed over the years is that our bodies are incredibly good at adapting. If one area becomes sore, another area will often quietly start helping out. At first, that's a really wonderful, helpful thing. It allows us to stay functional, keep working, and be relatively efficient at our work, so we can look after our kids and play sport and live our lives. But sometimes those helpful adaptations stay around a little longer than they're needed, and over time, the body can begin to work much harder than it should. And that's often what I'm looking for during an assessment. Not where something hurts, but where has the body been trying to help out and getting stuck. Because sometimes today's pain is only one chapter of the story that might have started weeks, months, or even years earlier. So one of the questions I often ask myself during an assessment is, what is the body trying to achieve? Is it trying to protect? Is it trying to avoid pain? Is it trying to create more stability? Is it compensating for another area that's not working well? For example, an old injury. Has it gradually adapted to a busy lifestyle, or to pregnancy, to a previous surgery, to extra stress that's prolonged, to sitting all day, to years of carrying children? Those questions often lead me towards a much deeper understanding than simply asking, where does it hurt? And once we begin to understand why the body has adapted with a particular strategy, then we can help it discover a better way of being. That's why I don't see my role as simply treating painful tissues. I see my role as helping people understand the story that their body is telling them, helping them to identify the primary driver or drivers, and helping them to then rebuild confidence, to discover movement that feels safe again. Because once people begin to understand what's happening in their own body, fear can start to give way to curiosity, understanding. These can open the door to change. If there's one thing I'd love for you to remember from today, it's that pain points us towards a problem, but it doesn't always explain it. Sometimes the painful area is the primary driver, and sometimes it isn't. And often there are several different influences quietly working together in the background. That's why I think one of the most important, helpful questions that we can ask is, what story is my body trying to tell me? How is it trying to help me? So bringing it all together. Perhaps the next time you notice a painful shoulder, or a sore lower back, or an aching foot, rather than immediately asking, what happened this time and how do I get rid of it? Perhaps try asking, what might my body be telling me? I think those two are very different conversations. One is fighting against the symptom, and the other one is trying to understand and to support the body. And in my experience, that's often where things begin to really change. Not because we suddenly have all the answers, but we can ask better questions. Before I finish today, I'd simply like to invite you to try 3 things this week. They're certainly not magic or the only thing that matters, but because they've helped many people, myself included, become more connected with their own bodies. So my first invitation is to become a detective. Rather than only noticing where is the pain, try to notice the patterns around it. When is it better? When is it worse? What else is tight? What were you doing before the pain started hurting? What else changed when the pain changed? You don't need to solve any mysteries. Just become curious with what's going on for your whole body, given this situation. My second invitation is to listen to the quieter voices. This feeds on to the last one. Notice your breathing. How are you sleeping? What are your stress levels actually feeling like in your body? How confidently do you move? Do you stay away from certain movements because they hurt, or because you fear they're going to hurt? Or do you seem to move okay, but there's pain? Are you walking differently to how you would normally walk? Is there something different with how you're sitting? Pain might be the loudest voice, but what are the quieter voices that might be there too? And my third invitation is to be patient with your body. Our bodies are constantly adapting to the demands that we place on them, and they change all day, every day. The patterns we experience today have often developed over time. They rarely change overnight. So instead of expecting your body to become perfect or to change straight away, see if you can simply help it to become a little more comfortable, a little more adaptable, and a little more confident, one small step at a time. If today's conversation has made you stop and think a little, maybe, I wonder what my body is trying to tell me, I'd love to invite you to continue that conversation. I've created an interactive guide that Rather than simply giving you information, it asks you thoughtful questions to help you to explore the patterns that might be contributing to your systems. It's not designed to diagnose you, and it certainly does not replace a thorough assessment from a healthcare professional. It's simply to support you to understand and become more curious about your own story and beginning to recognize some of the influences that might be affecting the way your body is functioning. You'll find the link in the description below. Next week, we're going to explore another assumption I hear almost every day. I just need to strengthen my core, or I just need to stretch more, or I just need to activate my glutes, or I just need a little rest. Sometimes those things are exactly what we need. Sometimes they're only one piece of a much bigger picture. We'll unpack why recovery is rarely about finding one magic exercise or one perfect solution. Before you go, I'd love you to spend a moment reflecting on one question. If pain is the loudest voice, what quieter voices might your body also be trying to help you hear? I'd really genuinely love to hear your thoughts, so if you'd like to share them, leave me a comment below.
So that's it for today. Did it raise any questions or aha moments? If so, I'd love to hear them, so please put those in the comments section. I love answering questions. I hope you found today useful. And if you know someone who could use this information, please share it. Remember to comment, like, and subscribe. Until next time, and in health, bye for now.